Big amount here, 2.4 billion rand, in a market where we know there have been issues around, a little bit around liquidity, but also risk appetite. How was the uptake?
The uptick was actually very encouraging, Godfrey. I mean, I think it's interesting that in South Africa, you've had 4 securitization transactions across a number of different asset classes, RMBS, CMBS. You've had storecard receivables also within the securitization space. And that compares to developed markets where the securitization market is still very much finding its feet after the exit of government assistance earlier this year as well.
Absolutely. Now, we're talking about 2.4 billion rand here, and that brings the total this year, you were telling me earlier, to just over, what, 5 billion rand?
That's correct.
Now, compare that to 2009, where we know it was less for the whole year than this year. What is that saying about, first, the market in itself, and also investors' risk appetite?
The risk appetite, Godfrey, is significantly higher than it was in 2009, and actually in 2008 as well. And it's interesting because it comes from a number of, I think, predominant factors. I think one factor is if you look at securitizations within South Africa, traditionally they've been very well structured. So you had none of the degradation in South African securitizations that you had in the developed world as well. Right. So no AAA securities actually being downgraded to, AA or single A of that nature.
Right.
The other thing is that the level of what's called subordination on securitizations has actually risen due to a change of the methodology of some of the rating agencies.
Just explain those concepts so people can understand what we're talking about when you're talking about the level of subordination. What do you mean?
Absolutely. For every
and why is that significant?
It is, and that's a very good question, Godfrey. For every securitization, you have a lower piece that's actually sold to investors.
Okay.
And that lower piece actually takes the first loss in the event of any credit losses within the portfolio itself.
Okay.
So to the extent that that lower piece is somewhat larger, and it's actually been largening due to the change in criteria from some of the rating agencies, that makes it a safer bet for investors. So
who's buying these assets?
Traditional South African asset managers. So if you look across the space of South African asset managers, these are the same people who are buying corporate bonds, same people who are buying other types of securities as well. So no different from any of the bonds. Is
there a greater concentration of other types of investors into a particular security, or is just across the board, your different types of institutional investors?
It's pretty much across the board, but what's actually interesting, Godfrey, and it's a point I think that's well worth making, is that this increase in risk appetite is not just limited to securitization. We're seeing much greater appetite for just straight corporate debt across corporate South Africa as well. And we're also seeing the advent, very interestingly, of what's called the high yield market in South Africa. And by high yield, what I mean is companies that traditionally have not had access to the credit markets, and probably maybe slightly lower in terms of credit profile from the spectrum perspective,
right,
but of still very healthy companies that are now getting access for the first time.
Yeah. Now, we're talking about Absa here. Now, you did some deals earlier this year for the other companies. I think there's a deal for Edcon for their on the cards 2 structure. Then there was also a deal for Eskom. Now, what kind of companies are you seeing coming into the market now? And is there scope perhaps to get more names into this market as the year progresses?
Yeah, there absolutely is more scope. I mean, the types of assets that were being securitized right now, that we're seeing being securitized right now, are predominantly home mortgages. Right. And also storecard receivables. So the Edcon transaction that you alluded to earlier was actually receivable. So these are credit cards. When you go to your Edcon store and you pay using your credit card, what Edcon does is it takes that credit card receivable and it actually sells that to investors as well.
Okay.
So we're seeing that type of asset being
taking it off Edcon's balance sheet.
Correct. And Godfrey, this is an important, I think, phenomena for us to pay attention to going forward.
Yeah.
Because as companies try and expand their funding sources, what the securitization market is really telling us is that there's another avenue for them to actually expand their balance sheet just going forward.
One other issue that we spoke about earlier that we think is important and that's emerging now is the size of the money that you've been able to raise in this market. Now, 2.4 billion rand, I am thinking is a lot of money, but is that a lot of money in the scope of the type of market that we're talking about?
It absolutely is. I mean, this is the largest securitization that we've actually seen in the RMBS space in the last 2 to 3 years. We did a significant securitization for Edcon last year, was about 3.3 billion rand as well. But I think the point is that not just volumes are we seeing expanding, but also seeing the maturity of transactions expanding as well. So last year, for instance, most securitizations were limited to 3 years. We're now starting to see investors have appetite for 4 years, 5 years, and actually did one as far as 10 years earlier this year.
Why is that important?
It's important because it actually gives companies more certainty from a funding perspective. To the extent that you can lock in your funding at attractive rates for a longer time period, that's obviously better for your balance sheet.
Yeah, and you also spoke about the importance of the diversity of the asset classes that are being offered here. What types are being offered and how many? And is there scope perhaps to add even more?
Yeah, the asset classes right now are still fairly defensive. It's predominantly home mortgages. We're seeing storecard receivables. When you look at, for example, the US, we've started to see more esoteric asset classes actually being securitized. So in the US right now, we're seeing cell phone towers, we're seeing auto receivables, we're seeing credit card receivables.
Yeah.
I think that will happen over time. But what we're hearing from investors right now is we want something that's well understood and something that we can actually fit into.
When you mention the US, people begin thinking, oh, are we going the way of the US and the housing market and all the other issues that we know arose out of there? What danger, though, is there that our market could see similar types of stresses coming in?
Godfrey, I'd say that one of the things that's been particularly prevalent in South Africa, and I think South Africa has really excelled, is just the state of the banking industry overall. I think the securitization market is reflective of that. The type of assets that have been put into securitized portfolios are strong quality assets, and we've seen them actually perform very well in the course of the last 2-3 years as well. So South Africa actually is in much better position than developed markets.
Final question, pricing. How was that? How difficult was it?
Pricing has actually been coming in the course of the last 2 years. So the pricing, for example, in some of the Absa transactions that we did was sort of pretty much around the JIBOR plus 150 plus level. But the definite trend that we've seen in the course of the last couple of years is pricing actually come in fairly nicely.